Hi, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. I'm happy to continue my conversation with Phil Robinson, the screenwriter and director of the immortal film Field of Dreams. Turns out Phil's pretty good at TV reporting as well. He impressed the former host of Nightline.
Phil Alden Robinson has turned out to be a wonderful and totally unexpected asset to this program.
You'll see why next. I am delighted to welcome Phil Robinson back to the program. Last week, we, of course, went all through the making and meaning of Field of Dreams, the movie that he wrote the screenplay for and directed. And I told you then that he's also pretty good with television reporting, as you heard, or at least was referenced by Ted Koppel there a moment ago. What he was talking about, Phil, of course, you know, is that reporting these mini documentaries, I guess you call them, that you did for Nightline during the Civil War in Bosnia. What were you doing in Bosnia?
I had gotten a call from the UNHCR, UN High Commissioner for Refugees office. And they said, would you like to be an observer on a relief mission to Somalia? And I said, sure. I had just finished a movie. I wasn't ready to go back to work. I wanted to shake up my life a little bit. And I said, sure. And they called the next day and said, by the way, after Somalia, excuse me, we might go to Bosnia. You want to go there? I said, sure. And then she must have spoken to somebody who knows me, because on the third day she called and said, you understand we're going to have to sleep on the ground and that the food is bad. And I said, yeah, it's okay. Let's do it. And I instinctively went out and bought a video camera. It really wasn't a decision. I just felt like if I have a task for myself, I'll be able to emotionally handle what I'm going to see, because I knew there was bad stuff to see. And we went to Somalia first, and I just shot everything I saw. And then we flew to Zagreb and got a relief convoy on the coast of Croatia and drove into to Sarajevo and just filmed everything without really knowing what I was doing or why I was doing it, other than personally. It helped me see things. And when I got back, a friend of mine who was working for ABC News said, gee, we ought to show this stuff to Nightline. And they showed some of the footage, and Nightline said, well, this is really good. Let us cut it together, and then we'll interview you at the end. And I said, gee, I could be more articulate if you'd let me write something. And they said, do it. And they gave me an editor and let me cut these little pieces together. And it was a tremendous opportunity. I'm still very grateful to them for that.
What were you seeing there in
Somalia? The best example of this is there were people dying in the streets. This was before the Marines went in. There was just anarchy and mass starvation that was infuriating, because it wasn't because of a drought, it was because grown-ups had stolen the food. It was warlords keeping food from the other warlords' people. It was really horrible. And there was one day, and I think it was in Baidoa, and I walked into this little shack, and it was very dark. And I walked in with the camera up to my eye. It was very dark. And before my eye and before the camera could adjust to the dark, I heard this horrible sound, this rasping sound. And finally, when my eye adjusted and when the camera adjusted to the low light, I saw there was a young person on the floor, and this was the death rattle. This is somebody dying. This was a little hospital. There were nurses around, but nobody was helping this person because it was too late. And I remember wanting to flee. I wanted to run. And I just kept saying to myself, no, keep shooting, keep shooting, keep shooting. Don't move. Just stay here. This is why you're here.
What was it the UN High Commission wanted you guys, screenwriters and others, to convey? What was the reason for this?
Well, it was interesting. It was very unspecific, but there was a person at UNHCR who said more people learned about the killing fields of Cambodia from the motion picture, The Killing Fields, than from all of the publicity that we tried to generate about what was happening there. And so they, I think, very creatively thought, let's get some people in who work in different areas than what we, different fields than what we usually plow, you know, and maybe something will come of that.
You made, I think, 3 films for them, your Sarajevo trilogy, I think you called it. I want to talk about those in specific and let the audience see some of this work. One of them one of these documentaries you titled One Woman's Sarajevo, and there's this remarkable woman, Farida, is that how she pronounces it?
Yes.
Very lively personality, mordant wit she had. Tell us about Farida, how you found her and what you thought of her.
This was my second trip, and I told Nightline I'm going back, and I bought a better camera, and I have an idea, which is if I were going to Chicago, I'd want Mike Royko to take me around. If I were going to New York, I'd want Tony Guida to show me his New York. I want someone interesting to show me their Sarajevo in the midst of this war. And the executive producer, Tom Patag, said, the piece will be as good or as bad as the person you pick. So really take your time and pick the right person. And I got to Sarajevo and I was asking around, and someone said, how about so-and-so? I said, no, they're a politician. How about so-and-so? No, they've done a lot of press. And then they said, I have a friend who's a poet. And I said, oh, poet, that's a really good idea. And I said, is she funny? And he said, oh, yes, like all great poets, she has great humor and great sadness. I thought, this is great. And I said, well, let's call her up. He says, well, she has no phone. I said, well, can we go to her house? He goes, I don't know where she lives. I said, how are we going to find her? And he says, don't worry, this is Sarajevo, we'll find her. And he said, I saw her once carrying water in that neighborhood. So we drove to that neighborhood and asked around. And finally, we found the building she lived in. And we walked up 11 flights of stairs to her apartment. And he introduced me to her. And he said, Phil would like to, film you, showing him your Sarajevo. And she says, no, I don't know. Are you a news person? I said, no, I make feature films. She says, well, what have you done? I said, well, I don't know if you've seen it, Field of Dreams. She said, I love Field of Dreams. Let's do this. So the following day, we picked her up and spent a day just following her around town and just showing us places that meant something to her. And it was an extraordinary day, and she's an extraordinary person.
Well, you'll see that right now in this clip from One Woman's Sarajevo, Phil Robinson in Sarajevo with his camera, and Farida, who is talking about how Sarajevans are trying for normalcy despite what's going on around them.
There are snipers in the hills that surround Sarajevo, but there are streets whose geography or buildings offer protection from the guns. And after a year and a half of siege, Sarajevans have taken to those streets. It's equal parts fatalism, defiance, and necessity.
This is the spot where you can find water, I walked all around the town, all over the town. In the middle of this winter, I walked with the water canisters, and I picked some water and go back to the place where I live.
How long would it take you?
2 hours, about 2 hours. I was so happy. I took a great shower.
How often does that happen?
Almost never. Almost never.
There was another charming moment with her, but your charming observation that you and others had noticed that, despite what was going on, a country being ripped apart, a city being ripped to its heart, having its heart ripped out. The observation that Sarajevo women were pretty mindful, purposeful about looking good. And I want to play that clip, but you want to talk a little bit about it before or after?
Oh, well, just that as we were walking around for days, I noticed that a lot of women, their hair was done, they had makeup, they had dressed up. And this was in a city where just walking could get you killed. So you had to walk on certain streets where the buildings would block the snipers. And I thought, why are these people getting so dressed up? And so I asked Farida that question.
They tell me, the women of Sarajevo are good looking, in spite of war, but I think that the war is the main reason they are looking good. The women of Sarajevo try to survive And one of the forms of surviving here is to look good. Why not?
Now, do you do that more now than you used to?
Yes, I do. I do. I'm surprised. I never put any makeup, you know. And when war started, I suddenly decided to have my makeup, to get dressed all, you know. And I was very afraid of walking around Sarajevo, but I decided, okay, if I get killed, I don't want to look like nothing. I would like to look like good-looking woman. Even that.
Even dead. Sooner or later, so many conversations in Sarajevo turn, with a startling suddenness, to death.
That last observation, Phil, the conversations can go from the quotidian to being about mortality pretty fast.
Well, death was everywhere in Sarajevo at that time. The war was maybe a year and a half old at that point, and it was just everywhere. A soccer field had become a cemetery, enormous soccer field, because the cemeteries had filled up. You never were far away from the realization that there's someone out there with bad intention who's going to, if he sees you, he can shoot you, and if he can't see you, he can lob a mortar where you are. Frida and I went to the marketplace that felt like the safest place in town because it was surrounded by tall buildings. And about a week later, someone lobbed a mortar into that marketplace and killed dozens of people. You never were away from it.
You and I met 100 years ago at a television station in Schenectady. And your goal was to be a broadcast journalist.
Yes.
We see now with these documentaries what you would have given us over the years. Broadcast journalism is poorer for not having you in it. What happened?
Life happened. That station in Schenectady, Channel 6, where we both worked, I was going to college at the time, was a great place. There were some seriously good journalists there, very inspiring people. Our dear friend Ernie Tatro, who was the longest serving anchorman in America, was just great. And the news director, Don Decker, always sort of held my feet to the fire. When I'd write something, he'd read it and say, "Who cares?" And I would start to answer him, and he'd say, "Don't tell me, put it in the piece." So I learned a lot from all these people, from you and from Bill Duffy and all these people. And I thought, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I love this. You get to cross the rope, you know, you get to go where civilians can't go and see things and ask about things that normal people can't do. And it was 1970, I think, 69 or 70, and we had a draft lottery. And I had a number that I thought at the time was low enough to get me drafted. And to avoid getting drafted and going to Vietnam, I contacted the local congressman, Sam Stratton, who was high up on the Armed Services Committee. And I had everybody at Channel 6 who knew him contact him. And he got my orders changed. And I went into the Air Force as a motion picture television production officer. This was in lieu of being drafted. And that sent me to San Bernardino, California, where I made training films for 2 years, 9 months, 14 days, 6 hours and 23 minutes.
But who's counting?
Who's counting? When I was there, at that point, I thought, well, I guess I make films. And I was in Southern California. I thought, I'll just move into LA for a while and see what happens. And then inertia takes over and you're there. And next thing you know, you're on a different path. Had the draft not happened, I would have stayed in New York, and we'd be co-hosting. We would be Tony and Phil's New York.
I would sign up for that in a minute. So I guess it was the Air Force that made you what is it? Be the best that you can be. It's the Army slogan. For you, it was the Air Force.
I guess. But I will say this, though. Had I stayed in journalism longer, I think I would have learned the rules. And I don't think I could have made these pieces that I made for Nightline, because they're sort of wonderfully naive in a way. They're kind of innocent. It's just a guy and a camera. And I didn't have a lifetime of journalism skills to fall back on. I wasn't reporting a story. I was simply documenting what I saw. And that's what I like about those pieces, that they're not slick and they're not
Well, it's a good thing you didn't. It's a good thing you didn't know the rules, because if journalism relies, to the extent, let's put it that way, that journalism relies on the quote unquote rules, it's doing itself and us a disservice. We need more of what we're doing for Nightline. Like your Sarajevo diary, another episode for Nightline. I mean, there's a sequence there where you show a building that was the newspaper office, the daily newspaper, and it's just bombed out. But as you point out, the journalists are still putting out the paper every day, and you found that in the middle of Sarajevo, downtown, at what, noon every day, they were performing an American anti-war play.
Hair. They were putting on the musical Hair in the middle of this war. On my first day in Sarajevo, I was talking to Christiane Amanpour, and I said, I hear there's a play being put on. She said, yeah, it's Hair. Now, that's not what I had heard. I had heard something else, but I thought, man, if they're putting on Hair, I got to see this. And they got us an armored personnel carrier to take us downtown, and we go into this crowded theater. People are freezing. They got their coats on, and this fantastic rock band and great singers and dancers are putting on Hair. I was in tears at the end of this thing. I could barely see the viewfinder of the camera. It was so moving to me. And I went with the lead guitarist into a bar next door afterwards. And I said to him, tell me about this. How do you guys do this? And we had a wonderful afternoon, and I gave him my card. And a while after that, the group got in touch with me and said, we'd like to take you up on your kind offer to bring us to America. And I spent the next year trying to get them out. And it's a long story, which I'll spare you, but Congress got involved and US Information Agency got involved, and we had all these people involved, and we almost got them out. And then the UN discovered that these people were sneaking to the airport, and they shut it down. I was able to get two of them out, this guitarist and the lead singer. And they came over and they played a concert in the Capitol, and they played a concert here in LA. We're just trying to raise awareness about the war. The lead guitarist and I are still very good friends. He wound up marrying my secretary, actually. And they moved up to Seattle and had a child. And it's a wonderful story. And I would see his parents every time I went back to Sarajevo after that. But I just got so completely personally involved in the lives of these people. And I remember asking a journalist there, is it just me? And he said, oh no. He said, I've been to every terrible spot in the world, every war and every disaster in the world. He says, this place is different. He said, 24 hours after you get here, you're smuggling babies out. You know, he says, this place really touches you.
I want to go to another film called Freedom Song. Tell us what it was.
After Field of Dreams, as I said last week, I took a year off, and I was determined to read books that could not be made into movies. And I rented a little house at the beach, and I got my dog and a case of beer, and I just sat out on the porch and read. The first book I read was Parting the Waters by Taylor Branch, because I figured it's too big to be made into a movie. But salted throughout this book are these stories of a man named Bob Moses, who just passed away about a month ago, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And I just became obsessed with Bob Moses and SNCC. And I reached out to Bob, who was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I said, I want to make a movie about you. And he said, I didn't do anything. He said, you can't make a movie about me. It was the local people who risked their lives by housing us and feeding us. That's what the real movement is, not the famous people, it's the local people. And he said, if you want to make a movie, you got to make it about them. And I said, okay. And that began several years of going with Bob to Mississippi and meeting these people and learning their stories. and
You had to
and
gain,
gaining
you
their
had to
trust.
gain their, I'm sorry, you had to gain their trust, as I understand it, because they didn't want anything to do with movie, Hollywood.
Hollywood had not served the civil rights movement well. It usually showed stories of a good white guy coming in and saving the day. And the African American population basically kind of cowered in their homes waiting for the great white savior to show up, which of course is the opposite of what was happening down there. The FBI, the white FBI guys were the bad guys.
Well, to your point, in the movie Mississippi Burning, it's the FBI that have, wear the white hats and save everybody.
Right, which is exactly the opposite of what reality was. And I think by spending years going down to Mississippi and meeting people and getting their stories, and we actually convened what Bob called a history workshop. We brought people from all over the country who had participated in these events, these particular events, and spent several days letting them tell the story. And people realized we wanted to tell the real story. Freedom Song is basically the story of the events in Macomb, Mississippi, which is in the southwest corner of the state, in 3 or 4 months in 1961, which was just a perfect microcosm of the movement. Everything that happened in the movement happened in that small town. Successes and failures and beatings and murder and jailings.
Your mama know you're doing this?
My mother died 2 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. How about your daddy? So I can't talk to mine about this stuff.
Never known my father.
Give me a license. You're the who teaching the other how to vote, ain't you? What are you doing?
Taking on your badge number.
I'd like to make a phone call.
I have the right to make a phone call.
And you thought the particular specifics of McCown or a small town would best tell this much larger story?
Right. I think if you try to tell the big story, you wind up risking being this deep. You've got too much ground to cover and too many famous people and famous events. Get into the lives of these people, and we center the story on a family, on a young man and his father and the conflict between them. The father had come back from World War II thinking, okay, I fought the Germans, now I'm going to have democracy here at home. And he was cruelly deceived and wasn't allowed to vote, and almost lost his business for trying to get the vote. And so he counsels his son to go slow. And his son is impatient, he doesn't want to go slow. He's inspired by the sit-in students and the freedom riders. So it focuses on a family, and it tells the story of what happened in this town. And I think most people in the movement have said this is the movie that really captures what the movement was like at the ground level.
And this son, this young boy who's impatient, there's a scene where the experienced folks are teaching him what it means to be nonviolent.
You want to get served? I'll serve you. You want to eat what we eat? You like that stuff?
All right, let's try it again.
No way. You ain't ready.
Yeah, I am.
Oh, you a tough guy, huh?
Yeah.
But you're not tough enough to be nonviolent. People, if you fight back using your fists like this fool, they will beat you until you die. But if you can refrain from responding with violence, after a while they will not be able to continue.
What if the guy's crazy and won't stop?
Then I will rise at your funeral and say, damn, he was nonviolent.
Jack Newfield, a tremendous investigative reporter for so many years, had covered some of the murders in the South. Jack Newfield wrote a piece about your film, Phil, Freedom Song, which was on TNT, by the way, and thinking what?
2000.
Anyway, this is what Jack Newfield said about Freedom Song. The film is full of complicated emotional truth. It respects the intelligence of the audience. That's pretty high praise. It's not pretty high praise. It's extraordinary praise, because too much of my business, too much of your business doesn't respect the audience.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And Jack actually had covered the events that this movie portrays. He had stayed at the house of the man named Steptoe, Mr. Steptoe, who we gave a different name to. But there's a scene in the movie where people are finding guns hidden under cushions, and they find them in the cereal boxes, because when Bob Moses stayed at that house, he was nonviolent. Mr. Steptoe, out of deference to him, hid all the guns. But he was well armed, as many farmers and small town rural people were in those days.
Phil, it's been my pleasure. It's been my honor, actually, to go over your career with you, Field of Dreams, and some of the other movies, and your broadcast journalism. I thank you. I really have enjoyed today, and I thank you for all the time.
I thank you too, and you've always been an inspiration to me, because you are what I think of as a journalist. You are a great storyteller, and you're a truth teller, and it's an honor to know you and call you friend.
Thank you. I did send a check to you, and I guess
it cleared. It cleared.
Phil, take care.
You too, Tony.